The rescue. The night was quiet on the edge of the frontier settlement where Daniel Walker had built a modest shelter for himself. He liked the silence of the stars above the desert plains and the way the winds carried the scent of dust and dry stone. There was peace in isolation, and he thought he had left behind all the chaos of human and alien politics that raged in the larger galaxy. Daniel wanted nothing more than to be forgotten and to live out his days tending to small crops and repairing broken machines for barter. That peace shattered when he heard the faint cry of children carried on the wind. At first he thought it was his mind playing tricks on him, for there should not have been any children wandering at night. Not. On a world so far from the central trade lanes, the cry came again weak and trembling. He followed it across the rocky ground, his lantern held high until he found two small figures huddled against a jagged stone outcropping. They were not human. Their skin glowed faintly in the pale starlight, a strange hue that seemed to shimmer as if liquid light ran beneath the surface. Their eyes were large, wide with fear, and streaked with tears. They looked no older than 7 or 8 years by human measure, and they trembled as though the cold night would swallow them whole. Daniel froze for a moment. His mind told him to walk away. Aliens brought trouble, and every human on the frontier knew that helping the wrong kind could end with death. But his heart would not let him abandon them. He knelt down and spoke gently, though he knew they would not understand his words. He held out his hands, palms open, showing he meant no harm. The girls whimpered and pressed closer to each other. One clutched, a small piece of cloth torn and dirty as if it were all she had left of home. Daniel took off his coat and draped it around them. The younger one sniffled and leaned into the warmth while the older kept her wary eyes fixed on him. He lifted them, carefully one at a time. They were light as feathers, and he could feel how weak they were from hunger. He carried them back toward his cabin, the sound of their shallow breaths echoing in the night inside. The cabin Daniel set them down by the fire. The flames crackled and cast shadows on the walls. He cooked a small pot of stew with the last of his vegetables and some dried meat, and though it was simple, the girls devoured it as if they had not eaten in days. He watched them closely, noticing the way their hands shook, the way they flinched whenever the wind outside howled through the cracks in the walls. He wondered what horrors had driven them here alone and afraid. When their bellies were full, the younger one finally closed her eyes, curling against her sister. The older girl, however, kept staring at Daniel. Her gaze was sharp, but there was something else too. A glimmer of recognition, as if she could see beyond his rough exterior and sense his intention. He tried speaking slowly. Pointing to himself, Daniel, he said, tapping his chest. The older girl blinked, then whispered a sound strange and musical. Her voice was soft, but it carried the weight of a name. He realized she was trying to tell him who she was. He listened carefully as she repeated the sound Lyra. The little one stirred and mumbled another name, Saya. Daniel nodded and repeated them slowly until the older girl allowed the faintest smile to break through her fear. That night he did not sleep. He sat by the door, with his rifle across his lap. He had lived long enough on the frontier to know that children did not end up alone without reason. Someone or something had forced them out here, and if there were hunters on their trail, they would not give up easily. He kept the fire low and listened to every sound in the darkness. Beyond the thin walls, he thought he could hear movement like the shuffle of claws on stone or the faint hum of machinery. He tightened his grip on the rifle but forced himself to remain calm as dawn painted the sky with streaks of crimson and gold. Daniel looked back at the sleeping girls curled together in his coat. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of responsibility heavier than any tool he had carried or weapon he had raised. These children were not his, but fate had placed them in his hands. He could walk away and leave them to whatever fate chased them, or he could stand and protect them no matter the cost. By the time the sun rose fully, Daniel already knew his choice. He would keep them safe. Bonds of trust. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty land as Daniel moved quietly about his cabin. He cooked another meal of simple bread and stew and placed it before the two alien girls. They hesitated at first, glancing at each other as if unsure whether they were allowed to touch the food. Daniel gave a small nod and smiled gently, and with that reassurance, the younger girl, Saya, reached forward eagerly. Her sister Lyra followed a moment. Later, her movements careful and watchful. Daniel studied them as they ate, noting the faint patterns on their skin glowing softly like veins of light under glass. He had never seen a species quite like them, and yet in their faces, in their small, hesitant smiles, he saw something unmistakably familiar. They were children, frightened and lost, and no different from human children in that need for safety and warmth. After they ate, Daniel set about fixing a broken water pump near the cabin. The girls trailed after him at a cautious distance. Saya picked up a small stone and tapped it against another in a rhythm, while Lyra kept her eyes on Daniel, studying his every move. He tried speaking again, pointing to himself, repeating Daniel, then gesturing to them and repeating their names, Saya and Lyra. The younger one giggled softly, her voice chiming like wind through crystal, while Lyra remained serious but nodded slowly. Daniel then pointed at the sun and said sun, then at the ground and said earth. He kept repeating the words until they copied him with accents that turned the sounds into something strange but beautiful. He realized they were learning as quickly as he was, and a small bridge of language began to form. As the day stretched on, Daniel taught them small things. He showed them how to draw in the dirt with sticks, sketching a picture of a bird or a star, and then saying the word. The girls took turns drawing awkward shapes, their laughter spilling out when the pictures made little sense. Daniel felt something stir in his chest, a feeling he had not known since his own childhood when his sister had drawn shapes in the dust back on Earth. He had buried those memories long ago, yet here with two alien children, in the middle of nowhere, they rose to the surface again. By evening, the bond between them had grown. Lyra no longer kept her distance. Instead, she sat near him by the fire, clutching the piece of cloth she carried while Saya leaned against his side. Yawning, Daniel could sense the trust forming. It was fragile like thin glass, but it was real. He wondered what kind of family they had come from. What parents could have lost them on a planet like this? The cloth Lyra held was not just scrap. It had strange embroidery running along the edges, shimmering faintly in the firelight. Daniel suspected it was a mark of rank or heritage, something far beyond his simple life as a frontier settler. That night, as the stars filled the sky, Daniel carried his rifle again, but the girls slept peacefully curled under his blanket. He felt less like a man hiding from the world and more like a guardian of something rare and important. When the wind howled through the cracks, Saya whimpered, but instead of crying, she reached for his hand. Daniel let her hold it, her tiny glowing fingers warm against his rough calloused palm. Lyra opened her eyes and whispered one word in her language, a word Daniel did not know, but he understood its meaning by the way she said it. It was protector. The following morning, Daniel's suspicion became heavier. As he checked the horizon through his scope, he saw faint trails of smoke rising far to the east, too thin and precise to be natural. They were signals or engines. Whoever had let these children end up here was searching for them, and they were not far behind. He felt a knot tighten in his chest. Danger was coming, and the safety he had tried to build in this small cabin would not last. He looked at the girls playing with stones outside, unaware of the threat closing in, and he made a silent vow that no matter who came, he would not hand them over. When he stepped outside, Lyra turned toward him and tilted her head. Her sharp eyes studied his tense expression as if she could sense the storm gathering. Daniel forced a small smile and motioned them back inside. He did not know their words, but he hoped they would understand the meaning of his tone. He would keep them safe no matter the cost, hunters. In the dark. The air grew heavy that evening as Daniel prepared his cabin for the night. He placed extra wood on the fire and checked his rifle more than once while his eyes lingered on the eastern horizon, where smoke trails had risen the day before. The girl sensed his unease. Lyra sat close, her sharp eyes watching every sound outside while Saya clung to his arm, refusing to let go. Daniel felt their trust deepen with each passing hour, and that only strengthened his resolve. He had not asked for this, but fate had placed it in his hands and he would see it through. The first sign of danger came as the sun dipped below the hills. A low hum rolled through the valley, mechanical and deliberate. Daniel led the girls to the back room of the cabin, whispering for them to stay silent, though his words were human and theirs alien. Somehow they understood by his gestures and the urgency in his voice. He set them behind a wall and returned to the door, rifle ready. Shadows stretched long across the ground as 3 figures appeared from the dust. They were not human. Their bodies were thin, elongated, their armor dark and fitted with glowing lines pulsing like veins of fire. Each carried a weapon, sleek and sharp, their heads turned in unnatural jerks, scanning the area with insect-like precision Daniel had heard. Stories of raiders hired to hunt on behalf of alien lords, mercenaries with no loyalty. But credits. One of them raised a device, and it emitted a high-pitched tone. Daniel knew instantly they were tracking, and feared the girls might carry some hidden beacon. His heart pounded as the device led them closer to the cabin. He tightened his grip on the rifle, waiting until the nearest one crossed the threshold of his land. A breath later, the rifle cracked. The shot pierced the silence, and the mercenary fell with a hiss of alien blood steaming against the dust. The others scattered returning fire with beams of burning light. Daniel dove for cover behind the doorway, wood splintering as the cabin shook from the energy blasts. Inside, Saya whimpered, muffling her cries against her sister's shoulder. Lyra held her firmly, whispering words Daniel could not hear, but he knew they were meant to comfort. He returned fire, forcing the remaining raiders to retreat behind rocks. His pulse thundered in, his ears, yet his focus was sharp, clearer than it had been in years. He moved like the soldier he once had been, though he had tried to bury that past. His body remembered every motion, every instinct honed in battles long ago. The mercenaries regrouped and charged again. Daniel rolled from cover and fired at the legs of the first, sending it sprawling. The second aimed its weapon toward the cabin, but Daniel shouted a raw cry and struck it down before it could unleash a blast. He felt the burn of heat searing his shoulder where a bolt had grazed him, but he ignored the pain. The last hunter fled into the night, leaving behind the bodies of its comrades and the eerie hum of its machine. Daniel knew it would not give up. It would return with reinforcements and perhaps worse. When silence finally returned, he closed the door and barred it. He sank to the floor, breathing hard, sweat running down his face. The girls emerged from the back room, their glowing eyes wide. Saya ran to him, clutching his arm as if she feared he would vanish. Lyra approached slower and studied the wound on his shoulder. She pressed her small hand against it, and for a moment, Daniel felt warmth spreading as if her touch carried some hidden strength. He looked into her eyes and saw not just a child, but something greater, something powerful and ancient wrapped in innocence. That night, none of them slept. The fire burned low, while Daniel sat awake, rifle across his lap. The girls huddled close under his blanket, whispering to each other in their strange tongue. He thought about the raiders, their precision and their determination. Whoever these children were, they were valuable enough to risk lives to recover. He realized he was no longer protecting lost orphans. He was standing between them and forces that could shake entire worlds. As dawn approached, Daniel rose and checked the bodies outside. He buried them quickly, knowing more would come and that staying here was no longer safe. He returned to the cabin and looked at the girls. They stared back, waiting for his decision. He had once chosen isolation to escape the weight of responsibility, but now there was no escape. He was their shield, their protector, and he would carry them wherever they needed to go. The mother's arrival. The sky trembled with a low rumble long before the ship appeared. Daniel had spent the morning preparing to leave the cabin, gathering food, water, and tools into a worn satchel, while the girls stayed close to his side. The memory of the raiders lingered in his mind, and he knew more would follow soon. He was fastening the pack when the ground itself began to vibrate, a deep pulse rising from beneath the soil. Lyra froze her eyes wide, and Saya clutched Daniel's hand tightly as a massive shadow fell across the land. The ship descended like a living mountain of metal, its hull gleaming with shifting patterns of light that seemed to ripple like water. It was far larger than any vessel Daniel had ever seen, and it landed with a roar that shook the stones around his cabin. Dust rose in clouds as the great craft settled on legs thicker than trees. A ramp lowered slowly and a column of light poured onto the ground. A figure emerged, tall and imposing, wrapped in armor that shimmered with the same strange glow as the girl's skin. Her eyes burned with authority. Her posture radiated command, and her voice when she spoke rolled across the valley like thunder. Daniel raised his rifle instinctively, but Lyra ran forward shouting in her language. Her words tumbled out fast and desperate, and Daniel realized with a jolt that this towering figure was their mother. The woman's gaze swept across the scene and fell upon him. Her expression hardened. Her children were alive, yes, but they were in the arms of a human stranger standing over the bodies of dead raiders. She saw threat before she saw truth, and her hand moved to the weapon at her side. Daniel's heart pounded. He lifted his hand slowly, showing he meant no harm, but the rifle still hung by his shoulder. The alien mother advanced, her voice sharp and furious. The girls rushed to her, crying out their strange words. Lyra placed herself between Daniel and her mother, her arms spread as if to shield him. Saya pressed against his leg, trembling but refusing to let go. The woman halted, her weapon half drawn, her eyes narrowing at the sight of her daughters defending the human. There was a long silence, broken only by the wind. The woman's gaze flicked from her children to Daniel and back again. Slowly she lowered her weapon, though her stance remained rigid. Daniel took a careful step forward and pointed to the raider bodies, then to his wounded shoulder. He hoped the message was clear. He had not harmed her daughters, he had fought to protect them. Lyra spoke again, her voice steady this time, repeating the words she had once whispered to Daniel: protect her. The mother studied him more closely. Her anger did not vanish, but it shifted into something else: caution, curiosity, perhaps even respect. She spoke in her language, words Daniel could not understand, but her daughters answered quickly, their small hands tugging at her armor, their voices insistent. Finally, the woman exhaled a sharp breath and straightened her posture. She gestured toward Daniel, a single sweeping motion that felt like both command and acknowledgement. Her soldiers appeared, then descending the ramp in perfect formation. Each bore armor and weapons far more advanced than anything Daniel had seen. They moved with precision surrounding the area, yet none approached aggressively. Instead, they stood at attention awaiting her word. She dismissed them with a flick of her hand, and they withdrew, leaving only her and the children and Daniel in the dust. She stepped closer, her presence overwhelming like a storm bearing down on him. Daniel did not move. He met her gaze with quiet resolve, unwilling to bow or cower, though his every instinct screamed at him to do so. The girls pressed closer to him, Saya clutching his hand while Lyra stood proudly at his side. The alien mother tilted her head as if measuring him, then finally extended her hand palm upward. A gesture Daniel recognized as neither threat nor command, but invitation. In that moment, Daniel understood she had come expecting to punish or reclaim, but her daughters had changed the path. She was testing him, measuring his worth as protector, as ally, as something yet unnamed. He lowered his rifle, stepped forward, and placed his hand against hers. Her skin was warm like the glow of the girls, and power seemed to hum beneath the surface of her palm. The silence stretched, but it was no longer hostile. The bond had shifted. Something new had begun, and Daniel sensed the next steps would decide not only his fate, but the fate of far more than his quiet frontier life. The strange reward? The air around the cabin felt different after the mother lowered her hand and accepted Daniel's gesture. The tension that had filled the valley began to ease, but it did not vanish. Her soldiers still stood in the distance, their silent presence like statues of steel waiting for a command. The girls clung to their mother now, yet they continued to glance back at Daniel, their trust in him shining clear. The woman studied the wound on his shoulder, her glowing eyes narrowing as if she carried not only concern, but calculation. Then, with a sharp order in her language, two of the soldiers stepped forward, carrying a small chest crafted of living metal that pulsed faintly with light. Daniel had expected gold or jewels or perhaps alien credits, but what the soldiers placed before him was nothing like treasure. The chest unfolded at her command, revealing a device that seemed to be both tool and symbol. It rose on its own, a lattice of silver and crystal strands weaving into a circlet shaped to fit a human head. The light that flowed through it matched the same glow that ran through the veins of the girls and their mother. The woman lifted it with care and held it toward Daniel, speaking words heavy with meaning. He did not understand her tongue, yet the intent was clear. This was her reward. Daniel shook his head, uncertain. His instincts told him to refuse, for nothing in the galaxy came without cost. But the woman's gaze was firm. She gestured toward the girls, then back to him, then to the sky above. It was as if she said, "You saved them, you deserve this and more." Daniel hesitated, yet Lyra stepped forward with a smile. She reached for the circlet and placed it gently in his hands. Saya laughed softly, as if she found joy in sharing something precious with him. The weight of it was light, yet when he touched it he felt a pulse like a heartbeat. Reluctantly, he placed the circlet upon his head. The moment it settled across his brow, a surge of warmth flooded through his body. The world sharpened his senses, stretching wider than they ever had. The whispers of the girls' voices became clearer, and though they spoke in their alien language, Daniel understood fragments. He heard Lyra say, "Protector," not as a sound, but as a meaning flowing directly into his mind. Saya's laughter carried not just noise, but pure feeling joy and relief. Daniel staggered with the weight of the gift. It was no simple token. It was a translator, a bridge between species, and perhaps more. The mother watched his reaction closely. Her lips curved in the faintest smile, though her eyes still held a warrior's sharpness. She spoke again, and this time Daniel caught the meaning. Her words reached his mind, not perfect, but enough. She said, "You are chosen." He tried to reply, stumbling with words, yet somehow she understood, for the circlet carried his meaning as well. The connection was raw but real. He removed the circlet carefully, holding it as though it were fire in his hands. He looked at her, searching for explanation. She raised her chin and told him through the new bond that this was an honor few ever received. A symbol of kinship granted only to those who had earned the trust of her blood. It meant protection and alliance, and it meant responsibility. Daniel felt the weight of those truths crash upon him like a storm. He had wanted a quiet life, yet now the path before him stretched into the unknown. The girls clapped their hands, excited, Saya running around him with laughter, while Lyra stood proud, as if presenting him to the world. The mother placed her hand upon his shoulder, gently but firmly, sealing the gesture of reward. Then she turned her gaze skyward, and her expression hardened. Daniel followed her eyes and saw distant lights moving against the darkening sky. The raiders had not given up. More ships were coming, drawn by the beacon of her arrival. Daniel tightened his grip on the circlet. He realized the reward was not just a gift. It was preparation for the battles ahead. It was her way of arming him, not with weapons, but with understanding and with a bond that could shift the balance of whatever conflict was unfolding. The ground rumbled again as the horizon filled with approaching engines. Daniel knew his world was about to change forever. He looked to the mother and she nodded. Her daughters pressed to his side, and together they waited for what came next. The hidden truth. The sky burned with the glow of approaching engines, and Daniel felt the ground vibrate beneath his boots. The mother raised her hand, and her soldiers moved in flawless formation, forming a protective wall around her and her daughters. Their weapons shimmered with energy, and their eyes never left the horizon. Daniel stood at her side, still holding the strange circlet that bound his mind to theirs. He felt the tension in the air, a storm of power and purpose gathering with each passing moment. The first of the enemy ships appeared sleek and dark, slicing through the clouds with predatory speed Daniel had faced mercenaries before, but these were not simple raiders. They flew in formation, disciplined and precise. The mother's expression hardened as she turned to Daniel. Her voice flowed into his mind through the bond. "You must understand who they are and who we are," she said. Her words carried weight, and sorrow and pride blended together. She told him that her people were rulers of a vast domain, feared across the stars, not merely for their strength, but for their lineage. Her daughters were not just children, but heirs to a throne that many coveted. If they had been lost, it would have meant more than grief. It would have meant chaos across countless worlds. Daniel listened as images and memories spilled into his mind, carried by the circlet. He saw great cities carved into the sides of glowing cliffs, fleets of ships stretching like silver rivers through space and thrones of crystal where voices of power echoed. He saw betrayal too, plots woven in shadows, enemies who would stop at nothing to take what was not theirs. The raiders who had come before were only pawns hired by rival factions. Their mission was to capture the children alive and use them as leverage. But when Daniel had stepped in and protected them, he had unknowingly shifted. The game's entire wars might have been delayed or ignited depending on whether the girls had lived or died. He felt the weight of it crash upon him. For all his desire to escape the galaxy, he had stumbled into the very heart of its struggle. The mother watched his reaction, her gaze unreadable, yet he sensed her testing him. She said, "You saved what even my armies could not, and for that, you have changed destiny." He wanted to argue that he was no hero, no savior, just a man trying to survive. But the bond left no room for lies. She could feel his heart just as he could feel the fierce love she carried for her children. The enemy ships descended, landing in the distance, and soldiers spilled out armored and armed. Their banners glowed with symbols Daniel did not recognize, but their intent was clear. This was an army of conquest sent to take the girls by force. The mother barked an order, and her warriors formed lines ready to fight. The girls clutched Daniel's hands, their glowing skin warm, and steady Lyra looked up at him and spoke a single word in his tongue, a word she had learned only days ago. Home. Daniel felt his chest tighten. He understood then that to them he was more than protector. He was anchor and safety, and perhaps family. The mother turned to him and placed the circlet back upon his brow. The surge of connection returned stronger than before. He felt her strategy, her determination, her willingness to sacrifice everything for her daughters. And he felt her decision to include him in that plan. She said, "Fight with us or walk away, but if you stand, we will call you one of our own." Daniel did not need time to answer. He had already made his choice when he lifted those children from the dust. He gripped his rifle firmly and nodded. The horizon erupted with fire as the first clash began. Energy bolts streaked across the valley. Explosions shook the earth, and soldiers screamed their battle cries. Daniel fired into the chaos, his aim steady, his courage burning brighter. With every shot, he was no longer a lone settler hiding from the galaxy. He was a man standing at the side of a queen and her heirs against enemies who sought to enslave worlds. And for the first time in years, he felt alive with purpose, the choice, and the future. The valley was a storm of fire and light. Soldiers clashed in waves, their weapons sparking against shields of glowing energy. The mother's warriors moved with the precision of a single living machine, and Daniel fought at their side, every motion driven by instinct and by the bond of the circlet. His rifle cracked again and again, cutting through enemy ranks, while his body moved like the soldier he once had been. He had thought that part of himself long buried, but in the chaos of battle it came alive again, and he embraced it not for glory but for the two small girls who pressed themselves against the sheltering walls, whispering his name with faith that he would keep them safe. The enemy surged forward, yet each charge broke against the mother's line like waves on stone. Daniel caught glimpses of her in the fury, a figure of unshakable command, her armor glowing, her blade slicing arcs of pure light. She was more than warrior, she was sovereign, and her presence alone turned the tide of the fight. Still the enemy pressed harder, their numbers growing until the ground trembled beneath their march. Daniel knew this was no raid. This was the beginning of a war meant to break an empire through the bond he felt. The mother's mind reaching to his, her voice steady despite the chaos. She said, "They will never stop until my daughters are either taken or dead, and then the galaxy will fall into shadow. You saved them once, but now you must choose. Will you walk back to your quiet world, or will you stand with us and shape what comes next?" Daniel felt the weight of her words pressing into his chest like a hammer. He had longed for peace, for a life away from blood and conflict, but the truth stared back at him in the glowing eyes of the girls. They needed him, and not just for this fight, but for every storm that would follow. The battle roared around them, and Daniel turned his gaze to the horizon. The enemy was faltering, the lines breaking under the mother's power and the ferocity of her warriors. He fired his last rounds and dropped the empty rifle, reaching for the blade of a fallen soldier. His arms ached, his body screamed. Yet he stood tall, cutting through the last of the raiders until silence spread across the valley. The smoke cleared, revealing broken ground and shattered machines. The enemy was gone for now. The girls rushed to him, Saya leaping into his arms and Lyra standing firm at his side with a proud look on her face. He knelt, pulling them close, his heart pounding with relief. The mother approached slowly, her soldiers bowing as she passed. She studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she spoke, not through the circlet, but aloud in halting human words. "You are one of us now." The sound was rough, yet carried immense weight. Daniel realized this was more than gratitude. This was invitation to join her people, to stand not as outsider, but as part of their bloodline's protection. He rose to his feet, weary yet unbroken. He looked at the ship looming above them and at the endless stars beyond. He thought of his cabin and the life he had chosen there, a life of solitude and silence. But that life had ended the moment he had lifted two frightened children from the dust. This was his new path, forged not by choice but by compassion. He nodded once, firm and resolute. The mother extended her hand once more, and he took it. The bond between them flared bright, filling him with visions of future battles, councils, alliances, and the shaping of a destiny larger than himself. The daughters cheered, their laughter ringing clear against the broken valley. Saya tugged his hand, while Lyra spoke proudly in her tongue, repeating the word that had become his title. Protector. Daniel smiled faintly as the ramp of the massive ship lowered again. This time he did not see a threat but a doorway into the future. As he walked with them toward the light of the ship, he felt the quiet life he had clung to slip away, replaced by a fire in his chest that told him he belonged not in hiding, but in the heart of the storm. The galaxy would remember this day, not as the day a queen retrieved her daughters, but as the day a human chose to stand with them, and in doing so altered the course of empires. The ship rose slowly, carrying them toward the stars, and Daniel did not look back. The future awaited, and he was ready. A new dawn. The stars stretched endless as the great ship cut through the black void. Daniel stood at the observation deck with Lyra and Saya pressed against the glass, their glowing hands leaving faint trails of light against the surface. Their laughter filled the chamber, soft and full of wonder, and for the first time since he had found them huddled and starving in the dust, he allowed himself to breathe deeply. He had saved them, but they had also saved him, drawing him out of the shadowed shell of solitude and back into the living pulse of the galaxy. The mother entered the chamber, her presence commanding yet no longer sharp with suspicion. Her armor shimmered under the starlight, and her eyes softened as she watched her daughters cling to the human she had once thought a threat. She approached slowly and spoke through the bond of the circlet. "You changed more than fate. You changed hearts." Daniel turned to her and met her gaze unflinching. He had no crown, no title, no bloodline of glory, but he carried something that her world of power often forgot: compassion, simple and fierce. He looked at the girls and felt a weight heavier than any weapon, for they were heirs to an empire, but to him they were children who had trusted his arms on a cold night. He vowed silently that he would never let the galaxy break the trust he had once believed his life's meaning ended in exile, yet now he saw it begin again on a path brighter than he had ever imagined. The mother placed her hand upon his shoulder and said aloud in her halting human tongue, "Protector." Her voice carried not command but honor, and her warriors echoed it with a single bow of respect. The ship glided past constellations of fire and stone toward the vast territories of her people. Daniel knew storms awaited he would face, wars and councils, betrayals and burdens that reached far beyond his cabin on the frontier. Yet he felt no fear, only resolve. The girls clung to him, smiling, their eyes full of stars. He understood then that he had not been given a reward of gold or power, but something greater, a place among them, a purpose in a galaxy that had almost forgotten what kindness could do. As the engines hummed and the stars drew closer, Daniel closed his eyes and allowed himself one final thought. He was no longer A man who hid from the world, he was the shield of 2 daughters, the ally of a queen, and the spark that could light the future of more worlds than he could count. The galaxy would never be the same, and neither would he. The end.